What if the giants who once ruled the earth cried out to heaven for mercy, and heaven answered? The Book of Enoch reveals a response so severe, so final, that it may explain why evil still haunts our world today. There is a moment buried inside one of the oldest religious texts on earth, where creatures of immense size and terrible strength fall to their knees and beg for something they never thought they would need. Mercy, not from a rival king, not from an army, but from the throne of heaven itself. Genesis tells us plainly that there were giants in the earth in those days, Genesis 6:4, and for centuries readers have skimmed past that verse as if it were a strange footnote rather than the opening line of one of the darkest chapters in sacred history. The Book of Enoch does not skim past it. It stops, it lingers, and it tells us exactly what happened when these beings realized their time had run out. To understand why the giants needed mercy at all, you have to understand who they were and where they came from. Enoch describes 200 angelic beings called watchers who looked down from the heavens and desired the daughters of men. They descended on Mount Hermon, bound themselves by oath, and took wives from among humanity. What followed was not simply forbidden love. It was a rupture in the created order itself. The offspring of these unions were the Nephilim, described in Enoch as towering hybrids whose appetite for food, and eventually for human flesh, could not be satisfied by the earth's natural provision. Genesis 6:4 calls them mighty men which were of old, men of renown. But that renown came at a horrifying cost. Enoch fills in what Genesis leaves out, painting a picture of devastation so complete that the earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of it. The giants grew faster than any human child, and their hunger grew with them. When the land could no longer feed them, Enoch records, they turned against humanity, against animals, against creation itself. Blood was spilled in quantities the earth had never known. Fields once tended for harvest were trampled and left barren, and entire communities lived under the shadow of beings who answered to no law but their own appetite. Enoch describes a world groaning under a weight it was never designed to carry, where the natural order humanity had known since Eden began to unravel thread by thread. And it is here, in the middle of this violence, that something unexpected happens. The giants, sensing the coming judgment, cry out, not in defiance but in desperation. They understand, perhaps for the first time, that they are not untouchable. They ask their fathers, the fallen watchers, to intercede on their behalf before the God whose laws they had shattered. This is where the story becomes something more than ancient horror. It becomes a question that echoes through every generation since. Does mercy have a limit? The watchers themselves seem to believe it might still be possible. Enoch tells us they approached Enoch himself, the righteous scribe, and begged him to write a petition to heaven on their behalf, hoping that his righteousness might carry weight where their corruption could not. There is something deeply human in this moment, even though the beings asking for help were anything but human in the way we understand it. They wanted a second chance. They wanted to believe that no fall was too great to be reversed. Scripture gives us a similar tension elsewhere. The prophet Ezekiel reminds us that God takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but desires that the wicked turn from his way and live. Ezekiel 33:11. If that principle holds true, then even the watchers and their monstrous offspring were not excluded from the possibility of grace, at least not by their own understanding. They believed the door might still be open. That belief is what sent their plea upward through Enoch, a mortal man chosen to carry a message no mortal had ever been asked to carry before. What makes this account so unsettling is not just the size or savagery of the giants. It is the fact that their cry for mercy sounds so familiar. Every one of us at some point has stood at the edge of a consequence we brought on ourselves and wondered if there was still a way out. The giants believed their strength made them exempt from judgment, until the moment it didn't. Their fathers believed their angelic nature placed them above accountability, until Enoch was sent to tell them otherwise. This is not simply a story about monsters from the deep past. It is a mirror held up to every generation that has ever mistaken power for permission. Jude, writing centuries later in the New Testament, looks back on this very event and does not soften it. He describes angels who kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, as being reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Jude 1:6. That single verse confirms what Enoch describes in far greater detail. This was not myth invented to frighten children. It was treated by early believers as real history, serious enough to be referenced as a warning centuries after it happened. So what did Enoch actually see when he carried their petition before God? What answer did he bring back to beings who believed their size and strength placed them beyond the reach of judgment? The response he delivered was not what the Watchers or their offspring expected, and it would go on to shape the spiritual battle described later in Scripture, from the flood that cleansed the earth to the very warnings Christ himself gave about the days before his return. Before we get to that answer, and to why it still matters for us today, I want to invite you to be part of this journey every time we uncover another hidden layer of these ancient texts. If these forgotten scriptures speak to something in you, something that institutional teaching has never fully addressed, then subscribing to this channel means you will never miss the moments when the veil is pulled back just a little further. And if the story of the Watchers and their fallen children has stirred something in you, there is a deeper resource waiting for you. We have put together a premium illustrated guide called The Forbidden Book of Enoch, walking you through the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the world before the flood in a way no single video ever could, with imagery that brings these ancient events to life on the page. You will find the link in the very first comment pinned right below this video, and if you have ever wanted a companion for this journey that you can hold in your hands and return to again and again, this guide was built for exactly that. Enoch did not walk into the presence of God the way we might imagine a hero walking into a throne room. He tells us that visions came upon him in his sleep, that he saw the heavens open and was carried through them, past clouds and mist and stars, until he stood before something he could barely describe with human language. He calls it a house of crystal, walls like ice yet burning, a throne surrounded by fire that no living being could approach without trembling. This was not poetic exaggeration meant to impress an audience. Enoch was a man being shown the reality behind everything he had only known as rumor and fear, and what he saw there would shape the answer he had to carry back down to earth. The message he received was not softened for the sake of the Watchers who sent him. God's response, as Enoch records it, begins by dismantling the very premise of their request. The Watchers had asked for intercession the way a man might ask another man to speak on his behalf, one equal appealing through another equal. But Enoch is told plainly that the Watchers were never meant to need intercession in the first place, because they were spiritual beings created to dwell in the heavens, not creatures bound by flesh who required mediation to approach their Creator. Their sin was not simply lust or disobedience. It was an abandonment of their entire created purpose, a decision to trade the eternal for the temporary. And Scripture elsewhere echoes this same principle when Paul writes that creation itself was made subject to vanity, not willingly. Romans 8:20. A vanity set loose in part by exactly this kind of rebellion against design. Enoch is told that the Watchers had it backward from the very beginning. They were holy beings who had watched over humanity from above, meant to intercede for others when necessary, not creatures who would one day require someone else to intercede on their behalf. The irony is almost unbearable when you sit with it. They had descended to gain what they thought would elevate them, and instead it stripped them of the very authority they once carried. So when the giants and their fathers hoped that Enoch's righteousness might purchase them a way back, heaven's answer made clear that some doors, once walked through, do not open again in the same direction. Enoch is told to return and speak to the Watchers directly, informing them that they will have no peace and that their sons, the giants, are doomed to destroy one another in warfare before the greater judgment even arrives. It is a chilling detail, one easy to miss if you are moving quickly through the text. The giants who begged for mercy were not simply going to fade away. They were told they would turn on each other first, consumed by the same violent hunger that had already devastated the earth around them, until almost nothing remained of what they had built through terror. This detail matters because it reveals something about the nature of the judgment itself. It was not an external strike alone, a lightning bolt from an angry sky. It was consequence unwinding naturally from a nature that had already been corrupted beyond restraint, the way a fire left untended eventually consumes even the ground that first fed it. The giants had been built on appetite without limit, and heaven's answer, in a sense, simply let that appetite run its course until it consumed the very beings who carried it. There is a sobering truth tucked inside this ancient warning, one that Scripture repeats again in different language centuries later through Paul, who writes that, "Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." Galatians 6:7. The giants sowed devastation, and their harvest was devastation returned upon themselves. For the watchers, the sentence was different but no less severe. Enoch describes them being bound, cast into darkness beneath the earth, held there until what the text calls the great day of judgment, a phrase that echoes forward into Jude's New Testament description of angels kept in everlasting chains under darkness, Jude 1:6. This was not a temporary punishment meant to be lifted after a period of reflection. It was described as fixed, final, awaiting a day still to come. When Enoch delivered this answer, he tells us the watchers wept and pleaded further, asking him to write yet another petition, hoping repetition might soften what a single request could not. Enoch agrees to write it, not because he believed it would change the outcome, but because even a doomed plea deserved to be carried faithfully to its end. What strikes many readers most is not the severity of the judgment itself, but the silence that follows it. Enoch describes no further negotiation, no divine debate, no reconsideration. The answer stands. And in that finality, there is a truth many people spend their whole lives avoiding. The truth that mercy, though vast and freely offered, is not identical to an absence of consequence. The God who is described throughout Scripture as slow to anger and abundant in mercy is the same God who tells Enoch that some choices, once fully made, cannot simply be unmade by asking twice. This is not cruelty. It is the weight of what it means for choices to actually matter, for love and warning to be genuine, rather than empty gestures repeated without consequence. It would be easy to read this part of Enoch's account and see only darkness, but there is something else moving beneath the surface of the text. Even as judgment is pronounced, the door toward humanity itself is never closed. The corruption belonged to the watchers and their offspring, not to mankind as a whole, and this distinction becomes essential as the narrative moves forward toward the flood that will soon cover the earth. God's answer to the giants was not the end of the story. It was the turning point that set everything else in motion, the moment when heaven drew a line that would eventually require the entire world to be washed clean before life could begin again. And Enoch himself, chosen to carry this answer, would never be quite the same man who had first fallen asleep and dreamed of crystal walls and burning thrones. He had seen behind the veil, and what he carried back down with him would shape not only the fate of the watchers, but the way generations after him would come to understand the seriousness of the invisible war unfolding above their heads. The flood that came after this judgment is often taught as a story about water rising and a boat surviving the storm. But Enoch's account forces us to see it differently. The flood was not the beginning of judgment against the giants. It was the completion of something that had already started the moment heaven gave its answer. Genesis tells us that the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence, in Genesis 6:11. And Enoch fills that single verse with the texture of what such corruption actually looked like on the ground, generation after generation, until the violence became something the land itself could no longer absorb. What happened to the giants themselves physically is where many people stop asking questions, assuming the flood simply erased them along with everything else. Enoch suggests something stranger and, in many ways, more disturbing. The giants were mortal in body, born of a union that was never meant to exist, but their spirits were something else entirely, carrying a trace of the angelic nature of their fathers alongside the corruption of human flesh. When their bodies perished, whether through the warfare heaven had foretold or through the flood that followed, their spirits did not simply vanish the way a human spirit might return to its creator. Enoch describes these spirits as being left without a body and without rest, wandering the earth as evil spirits, tormenting and afflicting long after the physical giants themselves were gone. This detail reframes an enormous portion of Scripture that most readers pass over without a second thought. Every time the Gospels describe Jesus casting out unclean spirits, every account of demonic affliction described by Mark or Luke Enoch's tradition suggests we may be looking at the long shadow cast by this ancient judgment. The spirits Christ confronted were not simply abstract evil floating without origin. According to this older reading, they were the disembodied remnants of a rebellion that began on Mount Hermon long before Bethlehem, a rebellion whose consequences never fully ended, only changed shape and grew quieter. When Jesus commands a legion of spirits out of the man among the tombs, and they beg him not to send them into the abyss, but instead into a herd of swine, there is an echo of the very same pleading Enoch recorded thousands of years earlier, spirits once again begging to avoid the full weight of confinement. It is worth noticing how consistently these spirits, whenever they speak in the Gospels, seem to already know exactly who Christ is and what authority he carries, crying out with a recognition that suggests a memory far older than the moment of the encounter itself, as though they were staring at the very judge who had once sealed their fate through Enoch centuries before. Peter, writing in his second epistle, seems to draw directly from this same well of understanding. He describes God not sparing the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, 2 Peter 2:4, placing this event in the same breath as his warning about the flood that came upon the world of the ungodly, 2 Peter 2:5. Peter is not inventing new theology here. He is assuming his readers already understand the story Enoch tells in far greater detail, treating it as shared knowledge rather than something requiring explanation. This alone tells us how seriously the early church regarded this account, even though it would later be excluded from most canonical collections, and it raises a question worth sitting with. How much of what shaped the earliest Christian understanding of evil has simply been forgotten by generations who were never handed the fuller picture? There is something worth sitting with, something almost unsettling once it sinks in the fact that judgment against the Watchers did not simply erase evil from the world. It transformed evil into something less visible, more insidious, capable of moving through history without a body to anchor it to any single place or time. The physical threat of towering giants walking the earth ended with the flood, but the spiritual battle Enoch describes did not end there. It simply changed its weapons. Where the giants once terrorized through raw physical violence, the spirits left behind began to work through influence, temptation, deception, and affliction, a shift from the visible battlefield to the invisible one, harder to see, and, for that very reason, harder to fight. This transition matters enormously for anyone trying to understand why Scripture speaks so consistently, book after book, about spiritual warfare in the centuries that follow, a theme too persistent to be dismissed as poetic language alone. Paul tells the Ephesians plainly that believers wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Ephesians 6:12. Enoch's account of what happened to the giant spirits gives that verse a history, a starting point, an explanation for why the battle described throughout the New Testament feels less like abstract metaphor and more like the continuation of a very specific and very old conflict. The war did not begin with the early church, and it certainly did not begin with us. It began on a mountain, with angels who should have known better, and it continued through spirits who refused to simply cease existing once their bodies failed them. What makes this reading so compelling to those who study it closely is how well it accounts for patterns that otherwise remain mysterious. Why does affliction so often carry a personality, a will, a resistance that responds to confrontation the way Christ's encounters in the Gospels describe? Enoch's framework offers an answer rooted not in speculation, but in a text that ancient believers considered authoritative enough to quote directly in what became New Testament scripture. The giants may have been destroyed. Their fathers may have been bound in chains of darkness awaiting a final judgment still to come. But something of that rebellion was left loose in the world, and understanding this gives new weight to every account of spiritual conflict that follows in the pages of Scripture, all the way through to the warnings Christ gave about the days before his return. It also reframes how we might read our own struggles, the moments when temptation feels less like a passing thought and more like a pressure with intention behind it, a pressure whose roots reach back further than most of us have ever been taught to imagine. If Enoch's account is even partly accurate, then the world before the flood was not the primitive, scattered collection of tribes many people imagine when they picture ancient history. It was something far more advanced, far more organized, and far more corrupted than most Sunday school lessons ever suggest. The Book of Jubilees, another ancient text that expands on Genesis in remarkable detail, describes knowledge passed down from the Watchers themselves, teachings about metalworking, astronomy, medicine, and warfare that humanity was never meant to possess in that form or at that time. This was not simply moral corruption spreading through ordinary human wickedness, the kind every generation struggles with in some form. It was technological and spiritual knowledge, stolen from heaven and placed into hands unprepared to carry its weight responsibly. This detail changes the way we should look at the strange stone structures scattered across our planet that continue to defy easy explanation. Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey predates Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years, and its massive carved pillars, some weighing many tons, were built by people conventional history insists should not have possessed the organization or tools to construct something so precise. Archaeologists remain divided on how a supposedly primitive hunter-gatherer society achieved this level of engineering, and every new excavation season seems to push the timeline of organized building even further back than the last one suggested. If Enoch's account of forbidden knowledge passed down from fallen watchers holds even a grain of truth, sites like this stop looking like an anomaly and start looking like a clue, a fingerprint left behind by a civilization whose true capabilities have been erased from the record we were taught to trust. Baalbek in modern Lebanon presents an even more staggering puzzle. The site contains a foundation platform built from stones so massive that modern engineering would struggle to move them even with today's heaviest cranes, some of them exceeding the weight of a fully loaded passenger jet. Local tradition and ancient legend long associated the site with giants, with builders whose scale matched the impossible weight of what they had constructed. Whether or not you take those legends literally, the stones themselves remain, sitting exactly where they were placed thousands of years ago, daring anyone to explain how they got there, using only the tools history insists were available at the time. Enoch does not mention Baalbek by name, but the tradition surrounding it fits disturbingly well within a world where giants once walked, built, and eventually fell. Further across the globe, sites like Pumapunku in Bolivia and Sacsayhuaman in Peru show the same pattern repeating itself. Massive stones, cut with a precision that modern tools still struggle to replicate, fitted together without mortar in patterns so exact that not even a blade of grass can slip between the joints. Conventional archaeology offers theories involving simple tools, patience, and manpower, and perhaps for some of these sites, that explanation is sufficient. But when you place these structures alongside a text like Enoch, which describes knowledge deliberately handed down from beings never meant to share it, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as mere coincidence repeated independently across cultures with no apparent contact between them, separated by entire oceans yet somehow arriving at nearly identical techniques and legends of giant builders from a lost age. Then there is Yonaguni, the underwater rock formation near Japan, with what appear to be carved steps and terraces sitting beneath the ocean at a depth consistent with land that would have been above water thousands of years before conventional history places advanced civilization anywhere in the region. Some geologists argue the formations are entirely natural, shaped by ordinary erosion and fracture lines. Others insist the precision of the angles suggests deliberate construction, right angles and straight edges that occur far too consistently to be the work of water and time alone. Enoch's account of a world so corrupted that it required total cleansing by flood offers one possible explanation for why such a site might now sit submerged, a remnant of something built before the waters came and swallowed an entire civilization along with its secrets. The Book of Jasher, though not part of the biblical canon, adds another layer to this picture, describing a pre-flood world filled with violence, idolatry, and a complete disregard for the moral order God had established. It paints humanity as having descended so far into corruption, influenced heavily by the presence and teaching of the Watchers and their offspring, that the flood became less a punishment invented out of anger and more a final, painful mercy, a way of stopping a corruption that showed no sign of slowing on its own. Genesis itself supports this reading when it says, "God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." Genesis 6:5, language far stronger than simple disobedience, describing a civilization that had turned entirely away from anything resembling its original design. What ties all of this together, the ancient texts and the stone structures that still stand today, is a pattern of advanced knowledge appearing where it should not exist, followed by sudden and catastrophic collapse. Enoch gives us a spiritual explanation for why that knowledge existed in the first place, and why it was ultimately taken away, hidden, or destroyed alongside the flood. The giants and their fathers did not simply vanish without a trace. They may have left behind fragments of what they built and what they taught, scattered across continents, that would later develop their own myths of giants, gods, and builders from before the flood, myths that echo one another across cultures with no reasonable explanation for how they could have influenced each other directly. This is why Enoch's account matters so deeply beyond its place as a religious text. It offers a framework for understanding evidence that conventional history struggles to explain on its own terms, evidence carved in stone and buried beneath oceans, waiting for anyone willing to look past the comfortable version of the past we were handed and ask what really happened in the centuries before the flood reshaped the entire world. It also invites a harder question, one worth carrying into everything that follows in this study. If the physical evidence of that lost world still surfaces in stone and legend after thousands of years, what else from that same corrupted knowledge might still be quietly shaping the world we live in today, hidden in plain sight rather than buried beneath the ocean? Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, wrote about this same period, with a tone far more matter-of-fact than most modern readers expect. He described the offspring of these unions between heavenly beings and human women as creatures of extraordinary strength, who trusted their power so completely that they treated every other living thing with contempt, imitating what Josephus calls the actions ascribed by the Greeks to giants. His account, written centuries after Enoch, treats the existence of these beings not as myth or legend, but as recorded history, the kind of detail a serious historian would only include if the tradition behind it was considered credible by the audience he was writing for, an audience that included educated Romans who would have dismissed obvious fabrication without hesitation and who expected their historians to distinguish carefully between legend and fact. This matters because it shows the story of the Watchers and their children was not confined to obscure religious circles, whispered about only in the margins. It was part of the broader cultural memory of the ancient world, referenced by Jewish and later Christian writers, as though everyone already understood the basic outline. The Genesis Apocryphon, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, adds another layer of confirmation to this picture. In it, Lamech, the father of Noah, is described as troubled by his newborn son's unusual appearance, wondering aloud whether the child might actually belong to the Watchers rather than to himself, a fear serious enough that he sends his own father, Methuselah, to consult with Enoch directly about the matter. An urgent journey undertaken because a father needed reassurance no ordinary priest or elder could offer him. This detail reveals just how present and immediate the threat of the Watchers felt to the people living through this period. It was not a distant myth referenced occasionally in passing. It was a fear woven into daily life, present even in the most intimate moments of a father wondering about his own child. The Book of Giants, also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, goes even further, giving voice directly to the giants themselves. In fragmentary but striking passages, two of the most prominent giants, named Gilgamesh and Hobabish in some versions of the text, are described having troubling dreams that foreshadow the coming judgment, dreams involving the flooding of the earth and the destruction of everything they had built. Rather than dismissing these visions as nothing more than nightmares to be forgotten by morning, the giants took them seriously enough to seek an interpreter, turning again to Enoch, whose reputation as one who understood the mysteries of heaven had apparently spread even among beings who should have had no reason to trust a human being's wisdom. This detail underscores something important about Enoch's role throughout this entire narrative, a role that only grows more central the deeper into these texts you go. He was not simply a passive recipient of visions, a bystander swept along by events beyond his control. He was recognized, even by corrupted and rebellious beings who despised nearly everything else about the order they had abandoned, as someone who carried real spiritual authority. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, an ancient Aramaic translation and commentary on the Torah, preserves yet another thread of this same tradition, identifying specific names among the fallen watchers and describing their descent to earth with details that align closely with what Enoch records independently, despite having been compiled through a completely separate scholarly and religious tradition. The consistency across these different sources, written in different languages in different regions, often centuries apart, is difficult to dismiss as simple coincidence or shared fiction. When multiple independent traditions converge on the same core narrative, the same names, the same locations, the same sequence of rebellion followed by judgment, it suggests these texts were drawing from a shared historical memory rather than inventing parallel myths from nothing. The Sibylline Oracles, a collection of prophetic writings that circulated widely in the ancient Mediterranean world, also reference this same period, describing a race of giants who once filled the earth with violence before being destroyed by the flood that followed their rebellion. What makes this particular source noteworthy is how far its influence spread beyond strictly Jewish or Christian circles, appearing in texts that Greek and Roman audiences also encountered and referenced in their own philosophical and literary traditions. The memory of giants who once ruled the earth through violence and who were ultimately swept away by divine judgment was apparently significant enough to echo across cultures that otherwise had very different religious frameworks entirely, suggesting a shared root far older than any single tradition, claiming ownership of the story, older perhaps than any of the civilizations that eventually wrote it down. Taken together, these sources paint a picture that Genesis alone only gestures toward, a single line easily overlooked by anyone reading quickly. The single verse describing giants in the earth becomes, when read alongside Enoch, Jubilees, Jasher, Josephus, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Sibylline Oracles, the surviving fragment of a much larger and more detailed tradition, one that ancient readers across multiple cultures and centuries apparently understood far better than we do today. This raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. If this much detail existed and circulated so widely in the ancient world, why does most modern religious teaching reduce it to a single confusing verse, rarely explained and almost never explored in any depth from the pulpit? The giants begged for mercy, and heaven answered with a truth that still echoes through every battle we face today, seen and unseen. Thank you for walking through this story with me. If these ancient texts stirred something in you, a hunger to understand what institutional teaching so often leaves out, subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next piece of this hidden history. And if you want to hold this world in your hands, our premium illustrated guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, is waiting for you in the very first comment pinned below, walking you deeper into the Watchers, the giants, and the world before the flood. Like this video, tell me your thoughts in the comments and stay close because the next video waiting on your screen goes even further than this one did.